It's another show, Dr. Farrell.
Yes, I know.
I know that many of your readers are eagerly awaiting the theme of this show, but they're going to have to wait.
So am I.
They're going to have to wait until they'll have to figure out the theme of this slowly over time. So, it will emerge, I am sure.
Okay.
I want to jump right into asking you about something I'm really curious about, though, because of Stephen King. So I'm a big fan of Oliver Stone's movie JFK, and I tell everybody they got to watch it. And I realize
Yes.
there's parts of, aside from the standard fictionalization disclaimer, there are parts of it that are fictionalized even on the facts,
Right.
and you can adjust for that. I mean, they're done to tell a good story, et cetera, et cetera. What I'm concerned about is I saw there's a book out by Stephen King. What's the date Kennedy was assassinated? 11/26, 63,
No,
22?
November 22nd, 1963. It was a Friday.
Yeah, so the name of the book is 11/22/63 by Stephen King, and I read this maybe a year ago or whenever it first came out. I read it when it first came out,
Right.
and then they made it into a mini series, and it's currently on Hulu, and so I've been watching that, and of course, the books are always better. Most other than Shawshank Redemption and Hearts in Atlantis, and maybe Misery and maybe The Shining. Most Stephen King movies, of which there are many, many, are horrible compared to the book. They're just really bad production values. This one is light on production values, but it's got a major star, and it is pretty decent for a sort of made-for-TV miniseries. And the theory has to do with Oswald really did do it, and that's sort of the conspiracy, and it's really a fascinating watch, and it makes you question. So, as it's kind of regurgitating some of the facts that were less emphasized in Oliver Stone's movie, it brought me to some questions that, given your JFK book, it made me want to ask you. So, one of them has to do with the attempt on General Walker's life.
Yes,
I just find that so anomalous.
it is.
So according to the movie, the Mannlicher Corcano rifle was used to an attempted assassination on General Walker before it was used in the Kennedy assassination.
Hmm.
And I can't help but go, Dr. Farrell, why would anybody do that? If you were going to plan, I mean, that's used as evidence in Stephen King's book to sort of say that, well, if this was a major conspiracy, you wouldn't just have this Mannlicher rifle out there.
Right.
They would have used a totally different weapon, and one thing wouldn't have had, it's too sloppy. And so one of the statements in the book is, if Oswald is there on that day taking that shot with that rifle at General Walker, then he's the one that killed Kennedy.
Right.
It essentially, I don't want to spoil the movie for anybody, or the book if you haven't read it. So it essentially says that.
Right.
And what's your take on that? Why the attempt on Walker? Why the use of that weapon? What gives you pause about it, if anything? Or is
Oh, wow. A lot gives me pause.
yeah,
I have to tell you, I did not talk about the attempt on General Walker's life in my JFK book. And the reason I didn't is because it is, in a certain sense, a tangent to the Kennedy assassination, as far as I'm concerned. But now let's go with it for a moment. In the standard official narrative, when it is talked about, it is talked about in the context of this is conclusive proof that Oswald was off his rocker. And, General Walker, for our European and African members, General Edwin Walker was a very, very right-wing American general, Army general. He was a member of an old militia group in this country that was called the Minutemen back in the 1960s. He was a member of the John Birch Society. He gave a number of talks around the country. excoriating basically liberalism in general, the Kennedy administration. But he took pot shots, as did a lot of people on the American right at that time. He took pot shots at the administration of Franklin Roosevelt, and then of course Harry Truman. But Walker was a very right-wing general. He was very well known. He was a popular figure with some people on the American right. Now, I have always been very suspicious about the Oswald alleged assassination attempt against General Walker for two basic reasons. The first reason is I've never been satisfied that Oswald, in fact, did attempt to assassinate General Walker. But my second reason for being extremely suspicious about it is much more, goes much more to the details of the Kennedy assassination, and here's why. In the first reports, and I've mentioned this documentary before, I think, when you and I have talked on these dialogues. There's a documentary out that's called Revision, Evidence of Revision, all right? And it's nothing but a collection with an absolutely sparse amount of commentary. For a documentary on the Kennedy assassination, the commentary in it is almost nil. There's maybe 30 seconds of commentary in an hour-and-a-half long documentary. The documentary itself consists of nothing but the earliest news reports arranged in chronological order as they were happening on the three major American television networks at that time, CBS, NBC, and ABC. Predominantly, it focuses on CBS because that was the dominant American television network at that time by far. And when you watch this, and I remember, to me, to me this documentary is very compelling because I was a boy. I was homesick from school that Friday, and then of course the whole weekend my family was glued to the television set. And so, for me, it's like reliving things that I saw in the newscasts as they were taking place. And if you watch this documentary over and over again, the initial reports after the assassination of the recovery of the alleged murder weapon in the school book depository there were reports given constantly of a 7.65 Mauser, all right? And you'll hear the CBS reporters, including Walter Cronkite himself, saying that they have recovered a 7.65 Mauser. And then later in the documentary, the deputy sheriff, Roger Craig, who was on duty that morning during the assassination and who was one of the first Dallas County sheriff's deputies into the school book depository on the 6th floor. He himself, as an eyewitness, said that the rifle that they recovered was a 7.65 Mauser. Another deputy who owned a sporting goods shop and therefore sold rifles and was very familiar with rifles said, yes, that's a Mauser. And Roger Craig even points out in this documentary that it had Mauser stamped right on the barrel, all right? Now, that weapon subsequently it just totally disappears from the narrative, all right? And later on, as the events are unfolding, Cronkite gets on and he says, we have been reporting a Mauser. Apparently, this is a mistake. It is a 6.5 Mannlicher Carchanto. He actually mispronounces the word and then goes on to explain that it's an Italian carbine, all right? Now, I have always thought that the original weapon probably was a Mauser, all right? It was a well-known, sturdy weapon. It was a long-range sniper's weapon.
It was a lot more accurate than the Mannlicher.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Preferred sniper weapon. I've held them. I've used them. And sports guys know all about them. The guys that run these stores that sell the guns. It's a very well-known weapon.
Yeah, it is. And that particular weapon, as I pointed out in my book, the 7.65 Mauser, that was a weapon that the Mauser company produced for Argentina. It was never a weapon that was produced for regular service in the German army. The German Mauser was an even larger caliber, much sturdier, longer range
Right.
sniper rifle. It was
Heavy too.
very heavy. It was kind of like the old M1 Garand in the American army. It was
Right.
a really good sniper's weapon. So what I think happened, Daniel, when you put all this together, is that the legend of Oswald was being created. We know that there were many Oswald doubles, at least two, possibly three Oswald doubles. And I've always thought that what happened was that they used one of these Oswald doubles, and they were creating the legend to associate him with the 6.5 Italian Mannlicher Carcano, and that this is why they had to make the change from the Mauser to the Mannlicher Carcano during the assassination attempt, because they had already tied this to the assassination attempt on General Walker. So in other words, I do not view the General Walker assassination attempt as an indictment of Lee Oswald. I view it even more strongly as a case for massive conspiracy around the assassination of President Kennedy, and a setting up of a legend that is going to finger Oswald as the patsy for the Kennedy assassination.
Well, there are a couple of disturbing things about that for me, and I still want to dig into
Sure.
the significance of General Walker. I'm not clear. I get his affiliations, and I get
Mhm.
the sort of superficial story of why Oswald supposedly would not like him.
Mhm.
I mean, but Oswald could have assassinated John Wayne or an early Ronald Reagan for that matter. I mean, other members of the Birch Society who were involved
Right.
in right-wing things, you know. But so I guess I have three questions. Number one, why General Walker
Mhm.
specifically? I mean, it doesn't strike me in all of this that we're saying anything is random. Number two,
Right.
even gullibility, the fact that we can sit there and watch them, it's almost like they switched rockets on the moon landing or something. You know, the
Oh,
first
good.
one was green, and then now there's this white one. I mean, they did it right in front of us. I mean,
Yes, they did.
it's not even a good magician trick. We remember, some of us remember a couple of minor changes in the 9/11 narrative too,
Yes.
on,
Yep.
you know, the day that was happening, and there have been other slightly disturbing modifications. So I want to know, you have to have either balls of steel or some kind of science of public mental manipulation, crowd manipulation, to be able to just go, I'm sorry. Well, you remember last episode when I kept changing hats? You
Yes.
know, for nobody to notice that or call it out would have been a little strange. So, my question. So my second question is, what's going on with that? And I suppose the third question should best be addressed by one of our guests on today's show, because we have among us. We're very honored to have among us someone who made some public statements about the Walker assassination. Actually said that the night that well, I'll let her tell it. So I'd like to introduce Marina Oswald. And just what happened was, the night that Oswald went out, he left a note in Russian that basically said what to do in case he didn't come back. And then when he came back, he told me that yes, he took a shot at. Sorry, what do I need to say again? Oh yeah, okay. He took a shot
Exactly.
at General Walker.
Exactly. What do I need to say again? Exactly.
I can't help but feel like, Marina, that your words are a little rehearsed and
Yeah.
don't sound really authentic. So that's the
Yeah.
third concern. And Dr. Farrell, maybe you can comment on that.
Well, look, Marina Oswald, bless her heart. This poor woman, was brought out of her homeland to a foreign country, essentially. And the next thing she knows, her husband is being accused of murdering the president. And if you examine what happens during, and Oliver Stone's movie JFK does this very, very well with the way he handled Marina, because in point of fact, the Warren Commission did grab her and keep her more or less sequestered from any sort of public interaction, especially with the press. And, bought her a nice dress, did up her hair in the nice style of the day. And then kind of the suspicion is, and I'm foursquare in agreement with those that think that she was coached in what to say. Now, the problem here is that, again, she points out that Lee wrote this note that, about he's going to be gone, and this is supposed to be when he made this attempt on General Walker. Again, I find this very, very suspicious, because we do know that Lee Oswald had some sort of relationship with the FBI as an informant. We also know that he had some sort of relationship with the CIA, because this came out many years after the Kennedy assassination, that he actually had a CIA payroll file. In other words, he was on their payroll at some point for something, we don't know what. So in other words, it looks to me like Oswald was being told, well, you go here and you do precisely these things. And of course, he doesn't know that what he's doing and the other doubles are creating a legend that's going to set him up as the patsy for the assassination. All right. And again, I go back to this business of the switching of the rifles, the fact that they have this Edwin Walker assassination attempt, and then they have to switch the rifles in Dallas at the last minute, because that was part of the plan, that a detail that kind of got out of control. So I do think that, going back to what I said before, I view the assassination attempt on General Walker in exactly the opposite way of the official narrative. To me, this is almost proof positive that what they're doing is they're creating a legend to set him up as the patsy. And again, I would not be surprised, frankly, Daniel, given General Walker and his philosophy, for want of a better word, and given his connections, that he could have staged that whole thing himself and may have, in some sense, been in on that, a very small aspect of the assassination plot against President Kennedy. So again, I'm just not convinced, I'm sorry, by these recent attempts to prop up the official narrative. I'm just not.
But why, if you keep coming back to the gun, why, how can they switch something as major as the murder weapon in front of us on TV, and it's barely even remembered, let alone noticed in the first place?
Right. Well, I think here's another problem. I think that we're used to the idea that, okay, they're reporting on things, that the investigation is unfolding and mistakes are going to be made. This is the standard explanation. But I think there's a deeper explanation, Daniel, and we see this a lot with operations or events that are extraordinarily suspicious, with major events in American history that have shifted domestic and foreign policy to some degree. The Kennedy assassination being one example, the Oklahoma City bombing, with the fact that there was a John Doe number 2 that they were looking for a day or two, and then all of a sudden he simply drops out of the narrative. And you can even go online and see these police artist sketches of John Doe number 2, and again, this figure simply drops out of the picture altogether. Now, what I think is going on, Daniel, and I believe this is a pattern that you can see from the Kennedy assassination through things like Waco, through the Oklahoma City bombing, and then especially in 9/11. I think what you have to remember is that when you're pulling off a covert operation, especially an operation that is being conducted by the so-called American deep state, that one principal aspect of the cover-up that they learned from the Kennedy assassination, in my opinion, was the importance and significance of data obfuscation. In other words, almost as soon as an event happens, what they will start doing is putting out two different data streams that are mutually contradictory on some detail or another. And what this does is it basically misdirects anybody that is questioning the official narrative into dead ends, false leads, false trails, things of this sort. It's the principle of the doubles again. If you create enough doubles and have them doing different things, and you leave so many trails of breadcrumbs to follow, that the story itself, the narrative that you want to put out there, is one amongst many possibilities. So you're short-circuiting the investigative process. This is hugely at work in 9/11. It's a little bit at work in the Oklahoma City bombing. You see some of these trails that go nowhere, that contradict details, and so on and so forth. And again, it's key in my thinking on these types of events that one of the key details that you do obfuscate intentionally is the murder weapon itself. You see this with the Kennedy assassination, with the Mauser, with the Mannlicher Carcano. You see it again in the Oklahoma City bombing. What was it that brought down the Murrah building? Well, you have the official explanation of the ammonium nitrate bombs. You have the alternative explanation of some sort of thermobaric bomb that brought it down, and that is coming out of a segment associated with the Oklahoma City alternative explanations that leads directly to other scandals, and that's a whole can of worms. You see it again with 9/11, particularly with all of the theories about how the Twin Towers came down, and accepting the official explanation of the airplane fuel and the pancake theory. You've got basically four different theories of controlled demolitions. So in other words, what you're doing is you're obfuscating the murder weapon, because the murder weapon itself is a key clue as to who might have done the deed. So this is a distinct pattern that is repeated from the Kennedy assassination all the way down to 9/11. So I view this as a necessary part of covert operations and psychological warfare, disinformation operations.
So I think that's a brilliant point. What you're saying is that that a component of propaganda is to intentionally distribute
Yes.
conflicting initial narratives from the
Yes.
start, so that you can confuse and conflate people trying to cling to any one narrative.
Right.
And you can also create the impression that, oh, this is a story that's unfolding, the data is going to be unclear, so
Right.
that any potential contradictions get written off as that sort of haziness. It's sort of like the difficult job theory.
Right.
Somebody gets caught massacring a bunch of unarmed people, and we say, well, they have a difficult job to do. We can't blame them for that, hold them accountable. We bury it in a haze of no one will ever know what happens, and war is difficult, and all these
Right.
other things. So we do the same thing, and it seems with propaganda, I wish there was a propaganda. There are various things, like at Kent University, there are centers for the study of propaganda. I wish somebody would take these things apart, disassemble, and sort of create a theory around what you're saying, because I see the same thing in the disappearance of Flight 370. The
Yes.
notion that there are multiple narratives put out from the beginning as to where they likely are, multiple search patterns, multiple explanations, and all of them couched with, well, we don't know anything for sure, but they still were sort of false leads.
Yes.
and rabbit trails. And I can't help but think this is you're onto something. This is a consistent methodology, and people that study false flag operations or other propaganda techniques can usually predict what actually, or can usually nail what actually happened in a given event by simply the spin of the propaganda. If you look at the propaganda as sort of dye in the water, you can kind of tell where the dye is coming from. You know,
Right.
I would love for somebody to really dig into this, because I think you're really on to something. It's disappointing too, though, because it requires both a complicit press that is willing
Yes.
to simply stop the investigation at a certain point and always go with the official narrative. And two, it requires a stupid press. It requires people who are sitting at the mics delivering this message, who do not look incredulous, roll their eyes, or ask questions, but are simply there to deliver the official output of whatever their superiors have decided in the back room is the narrative. And that's really disappointing as well.
Well, we have to remember something else too, Daniel, particularly with respect to the Kennedy assassination. But I also would aver that this is a key component of 9/11, and that is that during the late 50s on up into the early 60s, the CIA was running a program called Operation Mockingbird. And what that program did, and this came out during the Church Committee hearings under Senator Frank Church in the 1970s, of course, that was one of those congressional committees examining the assassinations, not just of President Kennedy, but of Senator Kennedy, of Dr. Martin Luther King. What Mockingbird was the CIA was planting people, agents in American media. And even more importantly, this is what people forget, even more importantly, they were planting people in the newswire services, United Press International, Associated Press, and so on and so forth. So that it's very important for people to understand all that you would really need to do in order to obfuscate the data stream as an event like this takes place is to have a wire service planted story get out there, put it out there, and start obfuscating things this way. And I think this is, I'm not saying when I say that CBS is reporting first a Mauser and then a Mannlicher Carcano that Walter Cronkite himself, was an agent of Operation Mockingbird. I think that would be highly unlikely. But I do think, given the nature of the way the media worked at that time, when it's so reliant on the teletypes and the wire services, that a story comes across the teletype, and what do? Well, you rip it, you underline the words you want to emphasize, you hand it to the anchor man, and he reads the story. All right. So this is something I think that was also going on. And again, you see this happening in a major way. If you really get in and dig into the details, it happens in a major way with 9/11. So I think you have to look at three elements here, Daniel, as part of the patterns of false flag operations. Number one is data obfuscation, as we've already mentioned. Number two is the idea of security stripping. All right. This is one of the most interesting things about that documentary, Evidence of Revision, that I mentioned earlier. Because at one point, Walter Cronkite reads a statement from Valerian Zorin, all right, from Radio Moscow, all right. Valerian Zorin, Cronkite, as he's reading the statement, he takes off his glasses and he says, well, this from Radio Moscow, it's very important to understand that this is a communist shill. And this is obviously nothing but propaganda. Well, Valerian Zorin, he goes on to read Valerian Zorin's statement, and Zorin points out that anybody who thinks that the assassination of President Kennedy could have been conducted by one guy, a mad lone nut, simply doesn't understand matters of security around leaders. He said for this to have even occurred, the security would have had to have been stripped from him. And, this is exactly what was the case, as Oliver Stone brings out so well in his movie.
The same logic as Julius Caesar.
The same logic as Julius.
One man can assassinate Caesar.
Right, exactly. You have the Praetorian Guard, in Rome. You've got the Secret Service around the president. And security was stripped from President Kennedy. Security protocols were definitely not followed in Dallas. And the same thing with 9/11. In that case, security was literally stripped not only from the president but from the country. So you have security stripping as the second element to
Well,
look
just to
for.
interject on security stripping, that by definition, when you strip security from a leader and then assassinate that leader, when it's not a lone nut,
Right.
that is the definition of a coup. The only two
Yes.
alternatives, really, in the Kennedy assassination theorem is that one, it's the random act of a crazy person, and two, a coup has taken place because
Yes.
it was not the random act of a crazy person.
Right. And just to add up the evidence that it was a conspiracy and a coup attempt, we have to remember two other important factors. The phone system in Washington, D.C. went completely dead for
Right.
about an hour, after the assassination. And on top of this, most of Kennedy's cabinet was in an airplane flying, I believe, to the Far East. And when they heard about the assassination, they went to get the code books to try and communicate with Washington, and the code books were not in the plane. So they were literally blinded. So there was a decapitation, effectively, that took place for just long enough for the coup organizers to get their act together and nail down all the little nails that needed to be nailed down. So security stripping is another key crucial point. The third thing that's been brought out, particularly in the aftermath of 9/11, is the concurrence of drills mimicking the actual events. And this has been brought out especially well by Webster Tarpley in his research, that you have actual drills concurrent with the events of 9/11, and the drills are mimicking actual aspects of 9/11. So what you also do is you confuse the command structure, and that goes back to data obfuscation. So yeah, I'm still unconvinced by the recent attempts, especially in this country, to try and shore up and save the Warren Report and save the official narrative. I'm just not convinced of any of them.
Yeah, I got to say, I'm an enormous Stephen King fan, but I'm still disappointed with the direction of that particular narrative. I get it. It would have been the easier thing for him to do to write a conspiracy novel, but
Right.
That wasn't his point. There's certain things you have to do to write a novel, and the premise of the novel requires, in this case, Oswald to sort of do it. But yeah, I want to recommend a book. There's a book called Propaganda and Mass Persuasion, a historical encyclopedia. And it goes back far enough. You can find this in Google Books and peruse it. But it goes back far enough to talk about Napoleon doing the same stuff.
Yes.
That they not only went around and had shill teachers and shill textbooks and suppressed dissent. They had shill churches. They had they used the propaganda arm at the time, which included artists. So visual artists were engaged to sort of create things that were supportive of the state, and they upheld the legend of the emperor by sort of nationalizing events around his life and so on. And that's just one of the sort of historical precedents that we look at. We know this now. We look at this stuff, and this isn't up for debate. This isn't like saying there are flying saucers or, who killed Karen Silkwood. This is historical data, and everything up until really the Cold War, we accept the premise that conspiracy is the norm, but and is prevalent throughout history. But once the Cold War happens, it's like we're still fighting it. It's like we've never left the Cold War, because we still cannot admit that since 1950 this goes on.
Right.
And that's disappointing.
Well, it's disappointing because unless we get to the point, Daniel, where we can look at the deep state in this country and the fact that it governs by covert means, by unethical means, by blackmail, by false flag operations, and so on and so forth. Unless we can get to that point, we're really not going to be able to understand why everything seems to be falling apart in this country, and for that matter within the West, because you're dealing with a very deep-seated cabal that's been there for a very long time, and that has manipulated events in order to get us into various wars. This has been going on since the Spanish-American War, as a matter of fact. And again, you had the coup attempt against Franklin Roosevelt that was plotted by Wall Street corporations and so on and so forth. They got Smedley Butler involved, and of course he exposed it, thank goodness. But this has been going on for a long time. The Kennedy assassination, in that sense, is just the most modern example of that cabal. But the other thing I think we have to look at, and I've mentioned that this point in the Third Way, is that there is something going on in the early 1950s with all of the congressional investigations of various groups infiltrating or exercising influence over the federal government, from the mafia. You had all those congressional committees investigating the mafia, McCarran, McClellan, and so on. You had the House Un-American Activities Committee, of course. You had, obviously, the infamous McCarthy episodes. And then you've got the Reese Committee investigating the foundation. So there's this explosion of all of these congressional investigations investigating this or that aspect of some aspect of penetration of the federal government on the part of a deep state. What's lacking is that none of these committees seem to have coordinated their investigations with each other. And more importantly, what's interesting to me, what is lacking in historical scholarship, is an attempt to go and examine that whole period from that framework. That you've got all of these committees. What is going on here? Why are all these committees suddenly coming out and investigating all these things? So, this is another aspect of this whole history of the deep state that I don't think anybody has adequately plumbed.
I think that's interesting. As much as I deplore the blacklist era and
Right.
the notion that, it's odd to me to hear people on the right saying McCarthy was right, those people should be chased out of the country, but at the same time deploring political correctness, which says that if you don't think the right things, you shouldn't be able to have a job and make a living or hold a position at a university. It's the exact same thing. It's just my opinion versus your opinion in terms of the ideology we want to support. So House Un-American committees was essentially implementing a kind of forced political correctness on a group of people. But when you tie it to, and the methodology is bigoted and small, and shallow. But when you tie it to the investigations of the mafia, and you tie it to investigations of, I think, frankly, I suspect that not only Ethel Rosenberg was innocent, but that her husband was potentially either framed or at least was a patsy and a cover for something else, because what he provided had almost no intelligence value to the Russians. But I look at that, the investigations around this notion that there are layers, government within a government, et cetera. And I suspect, if I were prone to think that, if I were prone to things that go bump in the night, I would say they're looking for aliens among us, and they don't know how to say it. But what I suspect is a part of it is they're dealing with this new notion that the Soviets sort of put forth. I mean, it's an old notion. It's something Adam Weishaupt held. It's something that it's part of revolutionary science. It is true of every revolutionary movement. The idea that a thing within a thing, a church within a church, a school within a school, a cabal within a cabal, and so on. And, it's part of the Masonic blind system. We've talked about that, oh, well, you're in, but we've lied to you all along in order to let you into this inner circle. And that's still not the inner circle. We lied to you all along. Welcome to the third degree, and so on. I look at that and I suspect that they're dealing with this psychology of, oh, crap. The very fact that things can be structured this way means that we don't know who to trust and what to question. But I also suspect if any of your narrative is right, that era in particular is when the Nazis sort of spread out across the globe, and some other things begin to happen.
Yes.
That there's this other third power, if you will, this middle people that we don't quite get, who are among us, that are sort of running things. If any of that's right, what this suggests is that they are actively looking for them, and all of this is either a cover or a shorthand or a way of just trying to grapple with, we know something's wrong, we know someone is among us, we don't know how to put our finger on it, or we certainly can't explain to you what we think, but we're not going to stop looking. We're going to root it out until we find this hidden layer.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, I suppose the easiest shorthand would be to say it's that layer that people call international finance. That even the highest powers in our government realize that they're not really the highest powers in our government, and that the state is a function of something else, and they're digging for this layer of control they can't find, using the mafia and
Right.
communism and everything else. I don't know how likely that is, but
Well, I think it's very likely. Let's look at two things in that respect. Let's look first of all at international finance during World War II, even prior to World War II, going back to this coup attempt against President Roosevelt. If you look at this, what you see, and then extending it all the way up into World War II, you see a certain cadre around Wall Street and American high finance that is basically fascist in its ideology. It's corporatist. It wants to use the power of the state and the power of corporations in conjunction with each other. This is definitely a very fascist sort of methodology and ideology. And you see this kind of clustered around the law firm of Sullivan and Cromwell. You know, John Foster Dulles, Allen Dulles, you know, they go over with President Wilson. They learn their geopolitical outlook primarily as part of the aftermath of World War II. These are the people involved in the Young and Dawes plan. Of course, Allen Dulles goes over as the head of the OSS branch in Zurich, Switzerland, and immediately climbs into bed with his old German business contacts and so on and so forth. He's instrumental with General Siebert in negotiating this to me, horrible Faustian deal with the Nazi devil in allowing General Galen's military intelligence network to survive completely intact with Galen in charge of it. You know, this is just a huge clue that there's this Anglo-American financial fascist component. There's a European fascist component connected to all of this. And then the second thing that I find extraordinarily curious in all of this is Senator McCarthy himself. McCarthy's getting intelligence from somewhere. We know that now with the Venona transcripts. He wasn't just making this stuff up. But this guy, you know, I don't view him as the great evil that the left in this country does. But he is a shameless political opportunist. And here's why. McCarthy, if you examine his record, he is defending some of the Nazi war criminals like Joachim Peiper during the Battle of the Bulge, that is responsible for the massacre of 80 plus American soldiers at Malmedy. He defends him. He has his own kind of ultra right-wing financial backing in Wisconsin that is very interesting to look at. So again, you look at all of these committees taking place during the 1950s, and it's like they're all being directed or all looking at various aspects. And the one thing that I find unique in all of these investigations, from the Reese Committee, House Un-American Activities Committee, McClellan, McCarran, the McCarthy committees, the one thing that they're not looking at is precisely these deals with the Nazi devil, with the fascists during World War II. This is the one thing that doesn't get a congressional investigation. So I find that highly suspicious as well. So I think, yeah, it's as if somebody, like you suggest, it's as if somebody knows there's there's some power or influence in the American deep state that we haven't quite identified. We can't quite put our finger on. And I think that's a large part of it right there, that significant absence in all of those congressional investigations at that period.
Well, and of course, it dominates Soviet and Red Chinese behavior, and of course,
Yes.
a lot of other third world countries at the time.
Yes, exactly.
So it's not just the West that's on the hunt for the hidden traitors among us.
Right, exactly, exactly. It's interesting you mentioned the Soviets, because I even have got that feeling, and it's not based on any evidence. I've even had that kind of impression with Khrushchev and his, now famous de-Stalinization speech that he gave to the Party Congress in the Soviet Union in 1954. That there's something going on there that doesn't quite add up either. So yeah, you're dealing with these, you're dealing with a shameless opportunist like McCarthy. You're dealing with a very serious committee like the Reece Committee. You're dealing with all of these mafia investigations, and lo and behold, the one thing that's not being addressed is there any post-war fascist influence that we've got to worry about? And of course there is, but it doesn't really surface until much, much later, and after the period of all of these congressional investigations basically being over.
Well, I've got one more major personage in the Kennedy assassination lore I want to ask you about. But before we move on to him, I want to ask, and you'll be very familiar with him. I want to ask, I just want to get clarity. So why the attempt on General Walker himself? Why Walker? Why that general? Other than that he's right wing, out of all the millions of people, I'm not quite sure. I can't link it back to anything. It just seems so random. Pick a right wing general out of your hat. Is there something special in Walker's history, background, or biography that we should be looking at?
I suspect, to be honest with you, that this is a case of an operation where you had the potential to silence someone that you considered either to be dangerous in what he was saying or to be talking too much. In other words, let's set up a fake assassination attempt on General Walker, and so much the better if it actually happens. If we actually get him, even better. That's what I think is going on there. And the reason, again, is that Walker had a certain hardcore following, particularly in the American South at that time. He was anti-segregation. He was many times sharing the podium or sharing conference breakfasts or dinners with then Governor of Alabama, George Wallace. So he's definitely in that wing. And if you can take someone like that out and at the same time use that event to tar someone else that you're setting up with as a patsy for something much bigger, so much the better. And if it fails, it fails. And the interesting thing about that is, after the Kennedy assassination and the connection of Lee Oswald to it, what you see happen is General Walker just simply kind of fades back into the woodwork, and you never hear about him. And he himself at that point began to tone down his remarks and to tailor back and scale back his public appearances rather dramatically. So something in that warned him off of any further activity. And I suspect very strongly that the reason he did that is because of his connections with the Hunts, the Murchisons, with the Texas oil men, and they in turn with their connections, their so-called private intelligence network, which, as it turns out now, thanks to the research of Professor Peter Dale Scott, turns out that private intelligence network was, guess what, West German intelligence, good old General Gehlen over there in Munich, Germany. That's what their private intelligence network was. So they had a direct connection to the German BND. And I suspect that maybe Walker, because he did, if memory serves me correctly, take several private trips over to Germany during this period. So he may have been one of the cutouts or go-betweens in that whole network, and he scaled his activity back dramatically.
Well, it is interesting that in 1965, I think it was. No, I'm sorry, 1967.
Hmm.
There was a libel judgment that he had won against the Associated Press,
Hmm.
and the court threw it out in '67, saying that he had led a charge of students against federal marshals. So there's this sort of mini scandal in '67. And then in '76, he is arrested on a charge of public lewdness in a restroom at a Dallas park, which is not a good place to get arrested for public lewdness. It's a very common place, and it implies, and frankly, it implies a homosexuality, and it implies a certain sort of um, loose, sort of random, closeted homosexuality, if you will.
Hmm.
So he's arrested in '76 on that, and then oddly enough, in the '80s, he gets his pension back. The army decides that he's gonna get his full pension and be restored because he'd been discharged from the army because of his sort of loud, outspoken behavior against
Right.
powers that be, etc. And then of course he dies of lung cancer in 1993. So it's an interesting trajectory, and he's had some brushes with the law, and if these kinds of things were going to be used to blackmail him or whatever, they would be the appropriate types of
Hmm.
threats,
Right.
in our society. So it's really interesting to watch. All right, so I want to come back around to another well-known figure in the JFK assassination lore, and that's George de Mohrenschildt. And we like George, prominent figure in our show, and my question about George de Mohrenschildt is, why did he commit suicide? And so now the narrative isn't quite sometimes accurate there. There's like, okay, they started investigating him and he immediately committed suicide. That's not exactly true. Apparently,
No.
according to public official lore, which I don't take any more seriously than any other lore, according to public official lore, there were multiple suicide attempts, and he finally committed suicide in a mental institution where he was staying for those suicide attempts. At least that's how I understand it. So my first question is, why did George de Mohrenschildt kill himself? And with that, I got to say there's a parallel between, he wrote George Bush, and I believe it was, and I have to look again, but
It was George. It was Hunt.
uh,
The Mohrenschildt wrote Hunt.
he wrote, well, George H.W. Bush wrote back to him. And what the gist of it
That's
is,
right.
yeah, what the gist of it is, de Mohrenschildt writes in, and you can see this in Wikipedia, but de Mohrenschildt writes in and he says, excuse the handwritten letter, but I'm in a hopeless situation. My wife and I are surrounded by vigilantes. My phone is bugged. We're being followed everywhere. And either the FBI is involved or they're ignoring my complaints. We're driven to insanity by this situation. That's a quote. And I've been behaving like a damn fool ever since. And he goes on and saying that he's tried to write stupidly and unsuccessfully about Lee Harvey Oswald, and he must have angered some people he doesn't know, but he's an elderly man with a sick wife, and all of this haunting is basically driving them off a cliff. Can you do anything? And George H.W. Bush responds, and he says, let me say, I know this has been difficult for you, and again, I'm paraphrasing, and he says, I understand your wife's health is poor, et cetera. I'm sorry to hear about this. The only thing I can tell you is that, the Warren Commission has long since subsided, so I can speculate that you must have become newsworthy again in the view of renewed interest in the Kennedy assassination, and are probably attracting some attention
Right.
From people in the media, but that I can't give you any further answer about this. And then that following that in 1976, that's the same year, so a few months later, his wife has him committed to a mental institution, and he's suffering from depression and a number of other things, according to this.
Mm-hmm.
And believed that the CIA and the Jewish mafia is what Wikipedia says is persecuting him. So I found that suicide understandable, but still strange.
Very strange. Let me take a break, and I'll come back and try and address that, because I think de Mohrenschildt is a crucial figure here that people don't get. So let me come back in just a few seconds.
Absolutely.
first word came at about 1:40. That information does not bear directly on the condition of President Kennedy. It comes from Kansas City, Missouri, where our affiliate KCMO says that Mrs. Bess Truman has told the KCMO that former President Truman is too upset to comment on today's tragic developments. As we said, there has been no word at all on the official word from the doctors at Parkland Hospital or the White House staff on the extent of the president's wounds.
All right. De Mohrenschildt has been understood in the assassination research community as a CIA agent. And I dispute this. This is where I think they go wrong. De Mohrenschildt, first of all, was an oil geologist. And in the oil geology community in Dallas, in Texas, at that time, this is a very tight-knit community. De Mohrenschildt is a German White Russian. He was born in Moiseer, Bielorussia. And if you want to know where Moiseer is, it's southeast of Minsk, the capital of Bielorussia, which is, of course, is where Lee Oswald ends up after he defects to the Soviet Union, and that's where he meets his future wife, Marina. De Mohrenschildt was in constant contact with the White Russian emigre community in Dallas, as we know. He was the fellow that introduced Lee Harvey Oswald to that community. And he also was in contact with the Hunts and Murchisons, all right? Now, one of the key episodes that people don't get that indicates where De Mohrenschildt's contacts lie, and it's very clear that he was an agent of some sort. His dealings during World War II are very dubious, to say the least. He's spying for the Germans, then he's spying for the French, for the Vichy French, and there are indications he may have been a double agent for the British, and on this goes. He was spying on Tito's Yugoslavia and so on. But once he's over in this country, he and his wife take a road trip down to Guatemala and Nicaragua and spy on the CIA bases where they're training the Cuban Air Force Brigade with those old B-26 Liberator bombers. So in other words, De Mohrenschildt, if he's a CIA agent, why is he spying on the CIA? You know, this makes no sense. I've always suspected, Daniel, that De Mohrenschildt was the liaison man, perhaps along with Edwin Walker, between the Texas oil men and their intelligence contacts in Galen's organization in West Germany. All right. So in other words, he's not a CIA agent directly. He's working for the CIA, but his direct controllers are German intelligence. All right. And if you look at what happens during his suicide, the reason I think he commits suicide, and I dispute that he does commit suicide, because he commits suicide with a shotgun, which would be, very difficult to do. And he commits suicide within, I think, a day before he was supposed to appear before the House Committee on Assassinations. They had called him as a witness. And as a matter of fact, there are indications that he intended to spill as much as he knew. Well, obviously, he knows George Bush. He knows the Murchisons. He knows the Hunts. He knows a great deal about that White Russian emigre community. I happen to think that he was a very good friend with a certain oil geologist of a certain prelate that you and I happen to know. This was a very, very tight-knit little community. De Mohrenschildt, I think, was actually murdered prior to his testimony to the House Committee on Assassinations. I think there was something that he some detail that he could have provided that would have either unraveled that whole thing or perhaps fingered other people that had hitherto gone unnoticed in the assassination. His connection to Bush in this regard is very, very suspect, because it's coming out now that there is some sort of relationship with between G.H.W. Bush and the Kennedy assassination. There's some pretty good prima facie arguments being advanced out there in the JFK assassination research community about that possibility. So I think de Mohrenschildt was murdered. It was made to look like suicide. A clumsy attempt, in my opinion. I don't think that he was directly working with the CIA. I think he's a cutout for German intelligence and the Texas oil men.
Well, I want to ask why you think he denied Oswald's role in the assassination of Kennedy. It strikes me every portrayal of de Mohrenschildt I have seen in the alternative sort of framework is that he is Oswald's handler.
Yes.
Even in Stephen King's book, one of the characters says it. If Oswald had a handler, it was de Mohrenschildt.
De Mohrenschildt, yes.
Yeah, and yet he denies Oswald's complicity. Is that a cover for the fact that, for the possibility that he's a handler, or do you think that he truly maintained Oswald's innocence?
I think he truly maintained Oswald's innocence. If he was a handler, he would have known that Oswald was being set up as a patsy. De Mohrenschildt, it's interesting, if you look at de Mohrenschildt, nobody really knows how he fits into all of this. If you watch the director's cut of Oliver Stone's JFK, there are a couple of scenes with de Mohrenschildt in it, all right? And you don't get a feel for how he really fits into the plot that's being advanced here, all right? And I think probably they made a wise decision to cut those scenes out of the theatrical release version of JFK, because you really don't know what he is or what's going on with him. And there again, I think that the reason he hasn't really been properly fit into the alternative research reconstructions of the Kennedy conspiracy is because they have consistently misinterpreted where his ultimate handlers were, and that was German intelligence, not the CIA. And once you pin him that way, once you look at all of the stuff he's doing and all of his strange connections and activities during World War II, and then the fact that, yeah, he's got white Russian background, this is where Lee Harvey Oswald ends up. You've got the Galen org with its human on-the-ground presence inside of the Soviet bloc. That is the CIA's human on-the-ground presence inside the Soviet bloc. It's not American agents, it's German agents, all right? Oswald speaking German. This is another fact that goes unnoticed. Oswald having George Lincoln Rockwell's address and phone number in his address book, the president of the American Nazi Party. So you've got all of these strange connections, and if you look at George de Mohrenschildt in that way, what you're doing is you're prying open that Pandora's box of what are all these Nazis doing in the middle of the JFK assassination. No one wants to go there. We can handle Cubans, we can handle mafia, we can handle CIA, we can even handle American banksters being upset that Kennedy is going to issue all of this debt-free money directly from the U.S. Treasury. But once you put de Mohrenschildt in the picture and really understand his connections and where they're leading and the background that they're leading to, that opens up that can of worms, and no one wants to go there. And that's what I think is happening here. And let me add one thing to this. If you look at, let me move out of the sun here. If you look at the Garrison investigation, which forms the basis, along with Jim Marrs' book, of Oliver Stone's movie. If you look closely at the Garrison investigations, he himself ran into this fascist connection, this Nazi connection. And he didn't really know what to do with it because, again, this doesn't compute. You know, these people aren't supposed to be anywhere remotely powerful enough to be involved in a stunt like this. So he doesn't even really bring it up in his trials of Clay Shaw, but it is there in his investigative records. So de Mohrenschildt is another one of these characters, I think, that gets sidelined in the Kennedy assassination, but I think he's a key, crucial figure. And this is the reason he's got too many connections to every little aspect of this thing for him not to be involved in some key role as Oswald's handler for somebody. So yeah, I hope that's making sense.
Yes, well, it's all a big mystery, a confusing mystery.
It's very confusing. Yeah, it is.
I want to take us in a final direction for today's show of asking about an entirely different conspiracy or collaboration. I am not sure which. So I want to get your take on the recent patriarchal parlay, for lack of a better term, between the Metropolitan of Moscow and, I'm sorry, the Patriarch of Moscow and the Pope and
Right.
Patriarch of Rome. And so I would not have thought that this would be the thing. I would have thought that it would be the Patriarch of Constantinople and the
Right.
Pope.
Right.
And when I see Moscow meeting with, aside from a lot of ecclesiastical changes you and I know took place around 2000, 2001, I would have, I'm just surprised at this. And I wonder if you can tell me what's behind this. Does this spell a new religious direction for either confession? Is this primarily political? Does this have to do with Russia as Russia? I realize those things are inseparable, but they're distinct. What's going on here that we can't see?
Oh, wow. I think this is a huge question. I think, first of all, the reason that Rome, as far as Rome is concerned, that they went for this meeting with Patriarch Kirill is because Rome knows that Constantinople, the Patriarchate of Constantinople, is basically a figurehead, and that it does not represent Orthodoxy very well. It doesn't represent the largest segment of Orthodoxy. The Patriarchate of Moscow does. And the Patriarchate, you know, if you're in the Roman Curia and you're looking at the Putin regime, they will know how to read the symbology and the use of symbols that Putin has surrounded himself with. You know, the use of the Romanov double-headed eagle is prominently displayed when you see Putin talking in the Kremlin or giving press conferences and so on. Putin is, you know, he's a practicing Russian Orthodox Christian, believe it or not. And this, you know, they're noticing this in Rome, and they can't help but think that, you know, there's something going on in Russia that is very, very different, that no one in the West gets. Rome would get it. Rome would understand what this is. And basically, I've said it before, Daniel, Russia is the first post-postmodern state. It is not a secular state in the sense that we understand it in the West, although it is very secular. It is a state that is deliberately, if you look at Putin and his advisors, they are deliberately challenging the globalist dogma in the West that the era of the nation state is over. It is now all up to transnational corporations, you know, the whole David Rockefeller, Zbigniew Brzezinski mantra. Putin is very deliberately challenging this, all right, very specifically addressing that. So this is the first thing I think that's going on. In Moscow's view, I think that they're looking at Francis in a very different way than we're looking at him. Right now in the election year in this country, everybody is outraged that Francis has been making these statements that makes him sound, they're calling him the Marxist Pope. Well, he's no such thing. I'm sorry. He's being more or less faithful to what Catholic social teaching has been all along. All right. So he's not, although he may sound like a Marxist at times, he's not really reflecting this at all. People have to get that out of their head. From Moscow's point of view, I think this meeting isn't about future changes in the confessions of either church. I think this meeting is about exactly what I wrote about in the blog. This is a meeting of two very powerful religious prelates that are looking at the Middle East, and they're looking at the genocide of Christians in the Middle East by radical Islam. And you have to remember in this respect, when they came out with that joint statement, when this started in Syria with the beheadings and in Iraq with the beheadings and executions of Nestorian clergymen or Coptic clergymen or Orthodox clergymen or Catholic clergymen. There have been several murders of Roman Catholic clergymen in Turkey, all right? Francis came out and said that Christians do have a right of self-defense. And as far as Rome is concerned, looking at Russia and looking at the revivification of the role of the Russian church in Russian society, they're thinking that this is a way that we can use a great power, perhaps to defend the interests of Christians in that region. Now, I'm going to crawl way out on a limb here, Daniel, and speculate wildly. If you're a Roman Catholic prelate concerned with the executions of your own clergy and the clergy of other churches in the Middle East and in Africa, and remember that the Pope and the Patriarch's statement addressed that problem very specifically, looking at the West and its utter lack of any sincere or genuine concern from its leadership about the Christian population in the Middle East. I think what you're going to do, if you're a Roman prelate, is you are going to start setting up the mechanism once again to be able to use and call upon private mercenary forces, if necessary, to defend your own people in the Middle East. Now, I realize but we have to remember that the mechanism of the Crusades was, as far as the Middle East was concerned, as far as Muslim Europe was concerned, the Crusades were viewed as defense, okay, to a Muslim invader. What they did was they set up, of course, the military orders, the crusading orders, the Templars, the Knights Hospitallers, and so on. Now, it's important for people to understand the Sovereign Military Order of Malta is still in existence. It is the logical, legal successor to the Knights Hospitallers. It has its own diplomatic immunity. In international law, it is a sovereign entity. It is still directly under papal jurisdiction. And there is an interesting connection of the Sovereign Military Order of Malta to the Blackwater mercenary group in this country, all right? So in other words, I think what they're doing, and I realize this is going to sound like the wildest nonsense that you can possibly imagine. I think what they're deliberately doing is they are setting up a mechanism where, if necessary, they can call upon military force for self-defense if the Western leadership continues to ignore the problem. That's exactly what I think is going on. Francis may seem like he is a very liberal pope, and in certain respects he is, but he's also the heir to this very, very long tradition, and the papal claims have not changed. And I think we are going to re-enter a period where we're going to see the papacy exercising temporal power once again, and doing so precisely in reaction and in response to what has been occurring with Christian population in the Muslim world. Absolutely, I think that's in the cards. It's happening. They're putting the mechanism in place. And so much the better if you can get the prelate of the major Orthodox body in the world agreeing with you on this problem. Because what that does is it will send a signal to the Copts, to the Nestorians, to the Armenians, to all the other Christian churches in that region of the world that, you know, something is happening, we are aware of the problem, and we're going to do something about it.
Well, I find it interesting, I guess, for different reasons. First, you know, Havana is the site, and I can't help the irony. You know, there's the Havana Conference called by Lucky Luciano to get all the mob leaders together and discuss mob practice.
Right.
You know, so I don't believe that has anything to do with this, but I just can't not witness the irony of it. But, you know, I think some people are kind of upset that, oh, you're meeting in Cuba, etc. And I find that to be a little hypocritical, simply because, you know, there's business conferences. The U.S. is holding business conferences in Cuba now. So Morgan Stanley's going, Home Depot, Caterpillar, Boeing, American Airlines, Heinz, Fox News, Fox News, Wall Street Journal, Sprint. All of these organizations, many of them quite conservative, are participating in business conferences there. There's nothing socialist about going to Canada unless the most right-wing businesses on earth are socialist. I think that's symbology. I don't think that's the real reason why people are disturbed. I suspect that there's something else, and this is your show, Dr. Farrell, so I'm really running this idea by you because this is an area where we talk so little about religion on the show, but obviously you have a lot of background. So I'm running by you a theory about this that I guess I want to see if you concur or want to expand on. If you do, I think that as long as you could keep East and West polarized, keep them apart, keep Moscow, which is the bastion of traditional orthodoxy on earth, the ecumenical patriarchate aside, you know, what a lot of people don't get is in the patriarchal world, patriarchs are equal. That is the basis of being Orthodox, is the claim that we're equal. And so the Patriarch of Constantinople doesn't rule over all the other patriarchs. It doesn't work that way. He's equal with Kirill. So Kirill, though, is the bastion. Kirill's patriarchate is the bastion of traditional orthodoxy. And of course, there's the Roman patriarchy. And keeping those apart gives us sort of permission to polarize and critique and take them down independently. So we can mock the Pope and Roman Catholicism over things like papal rape of small boys, you know, and we can attack the papacy over abortion and euthanasia and statements that the Pope makes about traditional gender roles. And then we can look at Orthodoxy. We can sort of dismiss them as Eastern or say, well, what are they, Roman Catholic, when they start agreeing with, which is most of the time actually on these issues. But as long as you get these two together, if you get East and West together, something becomes crazy abundantly clear. And that is that Eastern and Western Christianity worldwide for all time have agreed on certain things. Historic Christianity has agreed that abortion is a crime, has agreed on traditional gender roles, has agreed that biomedical manipulation or other disturbing of the remains of human beings or fundamentally altering the nature of a human being, including its physical material nature, are things the church is against. They have, all the way back to the Middle Ages, opposed secularism, and all the way back to ancient times, to the time of the Apostle Paul, have opposed consumerism.
Right.
And so these declarations that they're putting out, plus the social views, far from socialist, these are the historic views of Christianity. All Christians
Right.
that have been members of the historic confessions, they have always said that we should prefer the migrant and the refugee above ourselves. They have always argued for social equality. They have always argued for taking care of the poor. This is not some new socialist thing. This
Right.
is Christianity that Jesus and the apostles and all of the other bishops of the church taught. And so when you're allowed to kind of stay in a corner and look at that and say, oh, look at what the Roman Catholics are doing. It's so left wing or right wing or whatever you want to call it. But the moment you get East and West together, there's no real neutral ground anymore. You're either part of the historic Christian confession and going the way it has gone since its inception, or you are not.
Right.
And I think that is potentially the biggest threat that secularism and consumerism and political polarism
Yes.
and a whole bunch of other things has to face, is a united Christianity. And I
Well,
wonder what your take is on that.
Well, I agree with you. I think this is precisely the reason that, as far as Rome is concerned, that Francis was willing to meet with a patriarch of Moscow. I mean, this is an unprecedented event. This has never happened before. All right. I think that is a part of it. And the other thing that it is signaling is there is, as you know, a great section of Eastern Christianity that is part of the Unia. In other words, it's Eastern Christians using the Eastern ritual, but they're in communion with the papacy, not with the Orthodox Church. And that Unia has a great presence in places like the Ukraine. It has a great presence in places like Poland. So in other words, the Unia is also kind of on the front lines. It has a great presence in the Middle East. So it's kind of on the front lines between the East and the West, and also on the front lines in the Middle East. So I think there's something else that's happening here. As I said, I think this is a long-term move. This is the beginning of things where the two churches are going to at least try to coordinate their public or their politic activity, not necessarily entering into some grand ecumenical scheme or anything like that, but insofar as they can and are able to agree on certain things vis-a-vis society, vis-a-vis geopolitics and what's going on, they're going to cooperate. Now, the reason I think this is hugely significant is, first of all, as I said, I view Russia as kind of the first postmodern state in a certain sense. It's been through its militant secular phase with the Soviet Union. And okay, that didn't work. So now we're going to try something new. I think you're looking at a big kind of new sort of social experiment taking place in Russia. But what's also happening as we're speaking is you have now in Europe a backlash against the whole secular mantra of multiculturalism. And while it is true that you accept the refugee and so on and so forth, it is equally true that both churches have insisted that people coming into societies live and assimilate in the culture that they're in, all right? What is happening in Europe now is a tremendous backlash against this open borders policy and the continuing Islamization of Europe, all right? This is a huge movement in Europe. It cannot be underestimated. And I think as far as Rome is concerned, the dangers of this movement sliding into a kind of racist, ultra right-wing fascist reaction are very, very palpable. So I think what Rome is also trying to do is to position itself with this new overture to the Eastern Church, is trying to position itself in much the same way that the Patriarchate of Moscow is viewed as being a component of Russian culture, so that Rome will be in a position perhaps to influence that movement in Europe against this Islamization, to direct it and try and steer it away from dangerous paths that it might easily slip into. And it's, in that sense, it's a critique of this, any culture's as good as another sort of mentality that we've seen occurring in Western secular multiculturalism lately. I think Rome is trying to re-inject itself into this process. So I think we're dealing with the flip side here of what I suggested before, that Rome is deliberately setting up a mechanism that if it has to defend itself with force, it will do so. It has the ability to do so. And those claims have never been renounced. We need to understand this. Those claims have never, ever been renounced. And this is kind of the domestic policy flip side of that. They're positioning themselves to be the spokesman, to be the defender of Western culture. And like it or not, I keep reminding people, the foundations of our culture are in Christianity. Whether you are a Christian or not is beside the point. It's there, it's present in our law, it's present in our philosophy. Even atheism, in a certain sense, is grounded in a reaction to dogmas that have been passed down and assimilated in the culture. So I think Rome is positioning itself very, very carefully to be kind of the harbinger or the torchbearer, so to speak, for that view of culture. And the idea that there is actually a hierarchy of cultures. All cultures are not equal to each other. Some cultures are better than other cultures. So I think this is the flip side of what I said earlier. I'm basically in agreement with you.
Well, so that leads me to sort of the final question of our show, which, we get to talk about these topics so seldom, but with the release of some of your prior theological works in a much more prolific electronic form recently, and a lot of the Giza people sort of exploring and purchasing those, I noticed that you've also began sort of discussing some slightly theological topics, more
Right.
so in the private vid chats, but also sometimes in the blog posts.
Well, I do when
Right.
people ask me questions about it. I
Right.
don't make a point to, just harp on it.
Right. And I saw, and I wanted to say about what you were just saying, that it does strike me that by East and West sort of combining, they're exactly doing what you're saying. They're offering an alternative / antidote. I may not have chosen the word superiority, but I think you're right. But I was thinking of it as the alternative / antidote for Islamicization. That there's lots of ways to deal with the problems in the Middle East, but what they seem to be saying is it is not merely a choice between Islamicization on one hand and the American West on the other, the Anglo-American society.
Bingo.
That there is this other way that, in fact, affords us neither the need to blow people up who don't agree with us, nor fly in and bomb their village. It's sort of a whole different approach. So I find it fascinating in terms of the history of social culture. But on to this last religious question, there's a paper that I read that has you in the title. It's by a man at Rice University.
Mm-hmm.
And I found it fascinating. I didn't find it as non-complimentary as you might. I found the person to simply be honest about sort of his take on it, which is admittedly biased, has his own language to it, etc. But I found a couple of points that he made that I thought were very complimentary about your work and about your thought process, and that I thought surprising. And I wanted to run them by you and see if in fact they are true. So one of them, he made the statement that it did not seem throughout all of your work, you have this history of publishing 3 very well regarded, widely cited, to this day, books in 2016 are still citing your theological works over and over again as academic, as significant academic tomes. You have this history of doing this, you have your magnum opus that you self-published, and then you switch and you focus on your on what pays the bills, which is something it focuses on your interest in alternative science, alternative history, alternative archaeology, and
Right.
frankly, tanks and Nazis and big artillery and yeah, stuff like that. I mean, I really suspect if anybody were to say, well, how did Dr. Farrell go down this path? I would have said, it's all started with artillery one day. I don't.
And that's true.
You may think it's some kind of thing where he remembers some childhood trip to Egypt or something. I believe it started with big ass guns.
It did. It did. It started when I was a little boy, and my dad took me to the Battleship South Dakota Memorial, and there's this huge 16-inch cannon sitting out there. I thought, wow,
Yeah. So for those of you that are out in the woods somewhere with your the tailgate down on your RV, and you're popping a six-pack going, look at this big gun I got. You know, it's a fully automatic shotgun. What Dr. Farrell has done is trump you for all time by going, well, my gun's the size of the Great Pyramid. It's like, and I'm the one who came up with this darn theory. And no one else is saying, dude, look at it. It's a gun. Everyone else is like, it's a water cooler. It's a humidifier. This thing can power the earth. It's a power plant. It's a sonic resonator. Dr. Farrell's like, that's one big ass piece of artillery. He spotted it right away. So that said, you shifted gears to something that to that narrative, and what the author of the paper suggests. And I'll let your people go digging for this thing if they want. It's called a culture in the academy. But what he suggests is that you are not ruling out traditional Christianity, a place for conventionally transcendent worldviews, a theistic worldview that despite your delving into sort of the Hermetic realm and suggesting an alternative narrative that is very ancient. It goes so far back as to be pre-ancient, that you're not, in doing so, sort of going the way of Madame Blavatsky or the author of the Chariots of the Gods or anything else. You are leaving room for this, for a very, potentially a very theistic and conventionally transcendent worldview. That said, he makes a second observation, which I found very interesting, and so I'm going to ask you if both of these are true or either one of them. The second claim, and this is just my reading of him, which admittedly was in a hurry and cursory, but he seems to say that your explorations of alternative history, science, and archaeology actually are, they fit quite nicely with your theological exploration, that your theological exploration is about a claim that there is this forgotten layer of history, by which man has forgotten the God of Abraham, and you are essentially pulling that out through your theological exploration, and that this exploration of alternative history and science and archaeology is about other things that man has forgot, and that in fact these mesh rather perfectly, that your views about physics and are not in conflict with your views of supernaturalism, but they fit together. Right. That all of this thing is part of one single whole, that this is not what it looks like, which is a major left turn off into what some people consider left field. And so if he's right, what that means is your Orthodox critics, who are probably some of your biggest critics,
huge.
they may masquerade under different masks. They may go, I care about science and I dispute that, he's a pseudoscientist, and they try to get your Wikipedia page taken down and all that crap. Those assholes, and I'm sorry to say this on the air, but I'm going to, but those assholes really are, their problem is religious. It's a matter of religious bigotry. And yet I think they're concerned, they're fearful, the way some people are fearful about the Pope and the Patriarchs meeting, that you've taken a left turn and gone off the rails. And according to the author who wrote the paper about you at Rice University, far from that, you're on the same train track you've been on.
Yes. In most respects, I am. I've said over and over again, and this is something that you'll recall I said way back in the days that we were in college. I said this in my courses many times, that you cannot, regardless of whether you believe something personally, Edom, as the influence of theology on our culture, it is nonetheless true that in order to understand our culture, you must have a relatively knowledgeable literacy in theology and philosophy in order to understand our culture. Whether or not you personally subscribe to all of those things is another matter. But, you know, I go back to something that I've pointed out in the vid chats many times. Our culture is based ultimately on a proposition. You know, the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us, and, you know, the Word was in the beginning, and the Word was God, and so on and so forth. All of that from the Gospel of St. John. Well, if you look at the statement in the Greek, enarchi in logos ke logos in proston theon, you've got two key words there in the Greek, archi and logos, all right? And logos is a very rich term in the Greek. It means reason. It means the rational principle. And there's an astonishing assertion being made here that reason is ultimately a person, and personhood itself is ultimately undefinable. You can approximate it, but by maintaining this extraordinary proposition, it sets up its own critique. In other words, it's setting up the possibility, hey, no, I reject that proposition. And I reject it for the following what? Reasons, okay? So you're setting up the whole development of Western culture from, you know, the Middle Ages all the way up through the early Enlightenment, into the Enlightenment, into secularism. There's a proposition squatting right in the center of it that makes this whole development possible. This is why you have to understand, you have to be reasonably literate in philosophy, in theology, in the history of science, and so on, in order to understand our culture, because this is what's driving it, all right? And the other thing I've maintained is that at some point, the West lost a significant part of that narrative when the split between the churches occurred, and you had the creation of two very different cultures looking at that same proposition and working out implications as they each perceive it. So in other words, you cannot even understand why do we have a Western Europe and an Eastern Europe without this fundamental thing driving it in the background. You simply can't understand it. And by the same token, you really can't understand Islam either, because for a tremendous period of history, Islam is kind of the connecting bridge between the two. So, you know, paradoxically as that sounds, that's the case. So you have to have some sort of grounding. And in that sense, I agree with this author. I've been going out of my way in our vid chats to explain this topological metaphor that I think is lying behind a lot of these philosophical constructs. One of the things I'm trying to do by expressing it in that way is to show that there are parallels, detailed parallels, in the formal thinking of philosophical metaphysics, of theology, and mathematics. The bridge is not between religion and science. It's not between something superstitious and something reasonable, because the parallels of method are there. They both use a symbolic language, and they both use a high degree of, so to speak, rational assumption. You know, assume this and what falls out from it. What can you logically deduce from it? This is very prevalent in both methods. So yeah, I'm trying to bridge gaps in that sense. I'm trying to show that there's a great deal of what philosophers or theologians would have called natural theology, or natural philosophy as science used to be called, which I think have to get back to that tradition. What we see now masquerading as science is simply materialism, a kind of philosophical materialism that's trying to buttress itself by arguments from authority. It's not the natural philosophy that a Newton or even a James Clerk Maxwell, for that matter, would have understood if they were alive today to see what we're talking about, you know, when we say the word science. they'd be kind of mystified by it, because you have in those people this the presence of this idea of a transcendent reason. And even in some of the atheistic tendencies that you have in some scientists, you still have, if you examine it very carefully and strip away the buzzwords that tend to get people upset, if you look at the structure, you're still dealing with something that is ascribing a transcendent reason to their processes of thinking, to their processes of experimentation, and so on and so forth. So in that respect, yeah, I think he's absolutely right. There is no, for me, there's not a radical break. I started thinking, to be quite honest with you, Daniel, I've always had these interests in alternative explanations. I've been fascinated with this since I was a kid. It's nothing new for me. It may appear that way to people on the outside, looking in, so to speak. But if you know me personally, if you've known me personally for a long time, I've always had, I've always had these interests. It's nothing new for me. So in that respect, yeah, he pinned it very accurately.
Big guns and alternative explanations.
Big guns, right. Artillery. Well, artillery fascinates me. People ask me, why are you so fascinated with artillery? I think it's, just the engineering behind it. It's the physics behind it that fascinates me, that you're going to take this tube and shoot a projectile and hit a moving target that's, 20, 25 miles away. That takes a little thinking and a little thought. So I think that's what fascinates me.
I would have also added, and the testosterone behind it.
Well, maybe.
Who's got the bigger gun? Well, this quote from the paper, and I'll end with this, is I thought was pretty appropriate. He says, he meaning you, among other things, constructs in his popular works of alternative nonfiction a universe in which ancient biblical and mythic events possess real-world referentiality. And this referentiality is congruent with advanced science, Christian theism, and supernatural transcendence. And I thought that is a pretty apt description of what you write. Another way of saying it is simply that you didn't turn off your brain when you went to church, and you didn't turn off your soul when you read a science book.
Right. Yeah, that's very apt.
Now, you might carry a big gun to church, but there's a lot of Southern Baptists listening who probably are okay with that.
Well, but the problem here is that I have never, this is going to come as a shock to some people, but I have never seen any real ultimate distinction between the so-called atheist and a theist. The old joke is, what's the difference between an atheist and a mystic? Well, the mystic capitalizes the word nothing. because ultimately you're dealing with, when you're dealing with systems that deal with the transcendent, you're dealing with the idea that there can be no a priori reason for that. So in other words, you're dealing with something that falls completely outside of a dialectic of rationality and irrationality. There is no analog for it. And this is very much in keeping with the philosophical traditions of some of the Platonists and Neoplatonists. It's very much in keeping with the traditions of Hermeticism. It's very much a part of Christian theology, both East and West. It's very much a part of Jewish theology. It's very much a part of Jewish esotericism. And if you look at the kind of system that you see in Islam, it has a very similar tradition once you get into some of its esoteric systems. If you go to the Far East and look at some of the systems of Buddhism, you'll see the very same thing. So, I'm interested in the fact that we appear to be looking at a common structure masquerading behind a vast difference of technical vocabulary. But once you look at that structure, it then becomes possible to symbolize the structure itself. And that's what I mean by, the topological metaphor. So I hope that makes some sort of sense.
It does, Dr. Farrell. And I think, it's fitting that in this time of political primaries,
Oh, please don't go
we
there.
should end the show with a sock puppet. Because I think my guy
Hear,
is
hear.
just as good as any of their guys.
That's right. You know, I hate to say it, Catherine Fitz talked me into doing an interview tomorrow night about what's going on in American politics, and I have to be honest with you. I'm so turned off by it, by all of these yahoos. I just don't want to go there. So, you know, I'm trying to psych myself up for that tomorrow because, you know, she's kind of the same opinion. She doesn't want to go there either, but you know, we're staring at the demise of our country and civilization all at the same time in this election, it seems like. So, you know, we're going to try and figure out, you know, how do we deal with the worst case scenario?
Oh, I've already got plans. I'm thinking of moving to Slovenia.
Well, take me with you because this is just getting nuts. No, I'm serious. I thought about the same thing because it's getting to the point that you look you look at these candidates and that's what they are. They're sock puppets. And you know what's really unique about this, you look at it and you see all of them basically trying to pimp God, number one. And in the process of doing so, you see all of them resorting to a complete lack of any sort of courtesy towards each other, a complete breakdown. Debating has now in America become nothing but how can you dress up the ad hominem with the most offensive language possible. You know, and this is going on both sides of the aisle, and I'm thinking, oh my word, could it possibly be any worse? But I've learned not to say that after Clinton and Bush won and Obama. I've learned not to say could it get any worse, because it always does. So, you know, it's going to be an interesting interview.
I'm almost thinking that Dr. Farrell, we should just start your election plan now.
No, we are not
get
doing
you
that.
out there on that. We build a start with a bus.
No,
we all chip in on a bus.
No.
Well, come on, it's been a while.
I'm going to Slovenia.
We need a cowboy hat in the White House from South Dakota.
I'm going to Slovenia. No.
Well, it's been a really good show. So thank you.
Yeah, very good questions. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. All right, we'll get this up in the members section, and it should be up in just a few days.
All right. Thanks, Daniel.
You too.
Yeah, bye.